All right. Looks like we're live. Let me just check and make sure that everything's connected. Mercury is retrograde right now, so I take no chances on making sure that everything's working. So I'm not seeing myself on YouTube. Let me double check. Okay, well, if you can see me and hear me, please go ahead and comment. Let me know. I'm going to have to check and make sure. Let me see. It says I'm live. Let me view on YouTube really quick. There we go. I am live. I'm so excited. Looks like we've got a few people tuning in, which I'm really pumped about because today's topic is a fun one for me. If you can hear me and see me okay, please let me know. If you are new to my channel, my name is Jessie Da Silva. I'm known online as the Millennial Money Witch. That was a name given to me by Forbes. I did not come up with that myself. And I got that name for my unique brand of coaching, which pulls on these foundational principles of magic. And I teach everything through that: job hunting, money manifestation, building a business, recruiting and retaining talent. All of it can really boil down to those 3 steps to align your intentions, embody them deeply, take inspired action daily. This, if you have the link right now, this is a private video that I generally do for my community, who are readers and fans of my book, The Witch's Way to Wealth, The Every Witch's Guide to Making More Money Faster and Easier Than Ever. And in this book, I deep dive into a lot of these principles, but this is my chance to connect with the community, answer their questions, and review different topics that I find not just fascinating, but like critical to successful money management, money manifestation, practical strategies, all the things. Today's topic is going to be about the science behind manifestation. And I'm really excited about it because I am a nerd at the end of the day. As much as I am witchy and a Pisces and I love all of the esoteric, magical things, I truly believe, as a lot of witches do, that magic is science and science is magic. There is an explanation for a lot of the things that we previously haven't had proof for. And so I'm always all about that. I'm always reading up on it because it's just fascinating to me. And I'm one of those people where I can't just buy something. I can't just believe something unless I understand the building blocks and the proof behind it. I'm a former journalist and lawyer. So like at the end of the day, I still have that logical side to me. And I want to know like how these things work. Like that's just who I am. I find that convincing. And of course, it takes that feeling of being convincing for those things to actually work for you. So that's why I started reading about these different types of sciences. And if you want to like check my sources and things like that, it's all in the book. There's a very detailed and heavy research end notes like in that book. So feel free to check those out. We're going to do a lot today. I'm going to cover some light quantum physics. I am not a scientist, okay? Like I got a 17% on the ACT, the science section of the ACT. So if I can understand these principles, so can you. But some light quantum physics, then we're going to go into a little bit of biology / physics, like regular old physics. And then we're going to get into neuroscience. That's going to be our biggest portion. And then we're going to touch on epigenetics. And because I'm still a witch at the end of the day, I have like some bonus stuff, which is about witch wounds. We'll get into that with the epigenetics. And I'll probably do a whole witch cast on that later in the year. But let's kick it off. And if you're watching, I'd love for you to engage, ask questions, because that's just going to make this even more beneficial for you. So you can go ahead, leave a comment, and if I don't get to it while I'm explaining, I will get to it at the end. So first off, we're going to start with some light quantum physics. What you kind of have to know is that this is very theoretical, right? Like this isn't stuff that we can see. This is all stuff that's going to be based in theory, all right? So we kind of have to open our minds here. But the basic principle on why manifestation works within the scientific explanation of quantum physics is because everything in the world is made up of the same stuff. When I say that, I mean like when we get down to like atoms, quarks, things like that, we're all made up of matter. We're all the same thing. Matter is what makes up our bodies, which what makes up this laptop right in front of me, which makes up the trees. It's all matter. Different types of matter, of course, but at the end of the day, us, everything around us, this entire universe, all made up of matter. And matter is that term for like all of those little tiny building blocks, those like quantum physics building blocks, like the atoms and the quarks, all of that stuff. So, because of that, there is an argument to be made. Now, bear with me because this is going to sound wild. There's an argument to be made that because everything is made up of matter, including what's inside our brains, that reality actually starts within our minds. And how we arrive at this is kind of going back to that age-old question that people ask, like, oh, if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, does it make a sound? And a lot of quantum physics would say, like, no. I mean, it does in the sense that it's radiating out sound waves. But if nobody's there to perceive the sound, then is it actually making a sound? No, because the waves don't matter if there's not a squirrel or a person around to receive that sound, like with their ears. So that's what we're drawing on first. That's where we're looking at. So because of that, and that is drawn on this idea of the subjective versus the objective view. So basically, like I said, I come from a legal background, and you're taught in law school that all of the rules, all of the things are weighed by a reasonable person, right? Like you have to think, what would a reasonable person expect in this situation? What would a reasonable person believe? How would a reasonable person act? That's like the basis of basically everything. And that idea of a reasonable person is drawn based on like the great collective. So at first it seems like this is an objective perspective, right? Because it's this external thing. But the reality is that the reasonable person is made up of the average of everybody's collective experiences, right? Like that's really where we get to it. It's like, what would the average person think? And to understand what the average person thinks, you have to be able to understand what individuals think. So, what individual people think, me, the person speaking right now, you as somebody who's watching this, that what we think specifically, that is a subjective perspective. Okay, that's like internal. So basically, it's the objective is the external. It's like this kind of collective view. But I would basically say that because it's based on the collection of everybody's like lived experiences, it's really based on a lot of subjective perspectives, right? So if we can accept that the objective perspective doesn't really exist, it's all based in the subjective experience, that's how we can arrive at this place that if a tree falls in the woods, not only does it not make a sound, the tree, the woods, they don't exist without somebody or something there to experience it. And like we can get all philosophical and say like the other trees are experiencing it. Like I know trees talk to each other through the roots. I know that like plants are alive. I get it. But for the purposes of this example, we're sticking with that. So then if we can make the assumption that we're all made of the same stuff, we're all made of matter, and that reality can only exist through our perception of it, then we can take another leap and say that we can create reality. Because rather than perceiving something externally, we can perceive it internally, which can then project it out. All right. So the example I like to use is, if you ever saw that meme, it went around like a couple of years ago where everybody was like, oh my gosh, I'm on this scale. So there's a scale that people have seen where it's like, if you think of an apple, right? If I ask you right now to think of an apple, what comes to mind? What do you see? And people tend to fall on a range of different abilities to visualize in their minds. So, some people, like me, if I close my eyes and envision an apple, I see a very vivid apple. I see, like, I can see it sitting on a table. I see like the shine. I see the red and the green, because I like the pink lady apples, which are kind of a little bit pink with a little bit of green in there. I can really see that super vividly sitting. I can put it on my kitchen counter and see it as if it were sitting in front of me. Some people just see, like, kind of a vague, like a red shape maybe, or a green shape depending on what apples you like. Some people almost see like a cartoon of an apple, and then some people don't really see anything. They just think apple, right? Like, they're just thinking of the word apple, but they're not necessarily seeing it with their eyes closed. And so we fall on this range of abilities to visualize. And being able to do that, like, is what can not necessarily determine, but it's what can impact our ability to create reality. Because if I'm thinking of an apple and it's super vivid, and my thoughts and my brain are made of the same matter that an apple is made of, then it's not too much of a leap to say that I can project that out. And the way we're projecting that out, this is where we get into some of the biology and physics, is that everything that runs our bodies, that causes our bodies to like exist and like be able to live, all of our thoughts, it's kind of based in these vibrations. We're essentially constantly emitting electromagnetic fields. So you remember in the book or movie Frankenstein, how Dr. Frankenstein tries to get a, like, sets up an antenna and collects lightning, like, to get in a storm. He uses the lightning to shock awake his monster, to like reanimate the pieces. And that's based on this kind of same concept, that everything we're doing is kind of running on this like electrical circuit essentially. So everything that we do, if you think about like swimming in a pool, like, when we're swimming and it emits these ripples, it's the same kind of thing. We're emitting these vibrations because our brains are running on this electricity, our whole bodies are running on this electricity, and that emits a frequency essentially. And it's easy for some people to pick up on these frequencies. I think everybody's had the experience of feeling like someone's staring at them and turning, and someone was staring at them, they turn away, right? Like, having that ability to perceive the person staring, it's because that's them essentially, by them looking at you, directing their electromagnetic waves in your direction. And we're all connected because the earth has its own electric magnetic waves, okay? And that's constantly being emitted. So we're experiencing the influence of that, the experience of people around us, because that's how the matter shapes and forms into different things, really. So if you remember back to like middle school, grade school science, and they explained solids, liquids, and gases, we know that what makes solids, liquids, and gases are basically how the atoms are vibrating and packed in. So if you think about it, a solid is where the atoms are really closely packed together. So there are a lot of atoms and they're all really close together, and so they're vibrating at a certain rate. They're vibrating faster because they're bumping into each other. So I like to compare it to a party. Think of this is like a club that is popping, right? Everybody's like crowded, everybody's dancing. It's like that. That's what a solid is essentially those atoms are like in the club, just like really crowded and bumping into each other. And that's what allows things to be solid. A liquid, it's where there are fewer atoms spaced farther apart. So I say like that, think of like, more like a dinner party soiree kind of situation where you may have like more people in the house than you anticipate. but they're not necessarily bumping up against each other. They're able to like have more movement. And so it's a little bit more flowy, right? Like they're not super packed in, they're not bumping up against each other and causing those vibrations. It's a little bit different, right? And so that's what a liquid is. That's why liquids don't have any shape. They like flow. And then taking it to the last step with gases, it's like, this is like introvert parallel play hang, where it's like, we're gonna, like a couple of us are gonna sit in a living room and like play on our laptops together, where we're like spaced out, we're doing our own thing. Gases are that. Gases are like the atoms are super spaced out. There are not as many, and they're moving really slowly, right? Because they're not like stuffed together in a room or in whatever kind of situation. So that's how you can kind of think about it. That's where these vibrations are coming from. And so there have been studies shown that even people who are across the globe from each other, when they're doing a meditation at the same time, like I think it was a study of 6 people in different parts of the world who were going to meditate at the same time every day, I think to a specific like recording or something. And the scientists found that their breaths and their heartbeats all synced up together, and they started beating on the same rhythm. And it's because everything's emitting these frequencies, and that's how we pick up on things. So if we can visualize something within our mind and visualize it really vividly, it seeks to follow that we can then project that out, because that we're already doing that every day. And so if I can visualize the things that I want very vividly, and maybe you're not a visual person, that's okay. Maybe it's sound, maybe it's taste, maybe it's smell. We have these other senses that can allow us to make these visualizations super vivid. And that's going to like put that out there. And if you've ever seen examples of like how these sounds or how these, electrical currents affect matter, you've probably seen these videos where it's like scientists are using a violin bow to like play a note against a metal plate with sand on it, and the sand will rearrange itself into these really beautiful and intricate shapes. And it's the same thing with putting a certain amount of like electrical current into water. The water will spin around and start to form these different shapes. So that just goes to show like how that really works. I just realized I left my cat on the porch and she is screaming. So give me 1 second and I will be right back. I promise you. Give me just a second. Oh, okay, you got inside. All right, my apologies. It was a false alarm. She managed to find her way back into the house from the porch. I was paranoid there for a second. I didn't want anyone thinking I was abandoning my cat. So we know from these different experiments that these electrical currents and these vibrations do send out these certain frequencies, and that all of us, even our brains, live on these different frequencies. And they're like, we've got gamma, theta, beta, different waves on which we exist. And so this is where we're going to start getting into some neuroscience. But basically, these different brain waves that we emit, they're used at different times. So alpha is when we are fully awake and conscious and functioning, and how we are right now. You're listening, I'm talking. We're completely cognizant, awake, and aware. Whereas I believe it is beta. Beta is where beta and gamma are where we're like in different, or theta maybe. They're different levels of consciousness. So there's like a meditative state, there's a sleep state, all of these different states based on which waves that we are tuning into. That's our brain emits these waves based on these different levels of consciousness. And what's even more wild is that I believe for like the first 7 or so years, I think it's like 5 to 7 years of our lives, we're actually in a state that is close in adulthood. It's similar to our states of meditation, which is why we don't remember being babies. Right? We don't remember that. We don't have a lot of memories of being babies or toddlers because where we're essentially in a meditative state at that point. We're just soaking things in. And that is how it affects us as we grow up, because all of those things were basically just imprinted on us. And we reach those different levels of consciousness as we age. Like, we obviously get to that point where we're like, fully aware, fully functioning. But that's not to say that our experiences stop. Like, we aren't affected by experiences after that. Absolutely, we are, obviously. I mean, anybody who's living in this day and age with how chaotic the world is right now can tell you it is impacting us, right? So that's where we get into the neuroscience. So basically, how our brains work, and you probably know this, is that our brains are all connected by these cells called synapses. And so you can kind of think of it as like a connect the dots in your brain, where your whole brain looks like a really intricate version of like connect the dots. All these neurons are connected like a web, like a really dense web. That's what's going on. And your brain, it uses these pathways, the pathways between those neurons. Those are called neural pathways. And your brain wants to work efficiently. It's got basically two goals. It's to keep you alive, and it's to keep you safe. And when you use your intuition, for example, because I talk a lot about using your intuition when it comes to money and everything else, when you're using your intuition, that is actually a process that's happening in your brain. So you got all these neurons that have been built based on your experiences and your memories and everything else. And they're firing all the time. That's how we're able to like live and work and function and think. And when you're using your intuition, when you get like a gut feeling or something that you can't explain, what's actually happening is that parts of your brain are having a really fast conversation and analytical process they're going through. So it is a communication between the amygdala, which stores all of your emotions. That's what it dictates, or the amygdala is what governs your emotions, rather. And then the hippocampus, which stores your memories. And that, it's all different kinds of memories. And so what's happening is that when you have an intuitive feeling about something, what's happening is that your amygdala and your hippocampus are like lighting up and hanging out together. And they're like having a conversation where in seconds, what they're doing is analyzing all of your lived experiences. So millions of data points, and finding a pattern for survival. So they may not be able to pinpoint. They're essentially, what they're saying is like, I know we haven't lived through this exact situation, but it's very similar to all these other situations. And based on all of those situations and the experiences that we've had, this is what we need to do. And that's why you don't really have an explanation for why you need to do something, why it's intuitive, because you can't pinpoint it. It's not like exactly some other situation. It's like millions of other things that have happened that you can't necessarily summarize, but your brain is doing that within seconds. It's analyzing everything and saying, this is what I need to do for my survival. And that's how that works. But the issue is that the brain is also efficient. So it is going to travel the easiest pathways. So the ones that have been established over time. And so sometimes what happens is that when we're trying to plan or think about the future, even if something is a good change, for example, getting a new job, moving to a new city, starting a business, whatever it is that you're doing, even though you want this new thing, your brain is like, danger, Will Robinson. I don't know what that life is like. And even though I'm dissatisfied with this life, at least I know how to navigate it. And so that's where you'll have like fear and anxiety coming in, because it will identify even good things as a potential threat, because it's a threat to the status quo. And that's why it's really hard for us to change things in our lives. It's why it's so hard for us to take new actions or believe new thoughts. Like that's really difficult for our brains to do. So for us to override that, we have to create new pathways, because your brain is plastic, meaning that it can change and you can change it. And the way that you change that circuitry, it's a few different ways, but one of the best ways is going to be like the self-reflection. So, for example, Byron Katie wrote this book called The Work, where she's explaining, and I have to look up the questions so I can go over them with you, but how she helps you, how she explains the best way for you to understand yourself and your motivations and what you're going through. In this book, Loving What Is, she explains that you have to engage in reflection on whenever you're feeling fear or anxiety. And so she has you go through 4 questions that will help you identify what you need to be thinking or doing. So the first one she says is it true? The thought that you're having, the fear you're experiencing, is it true? The next one is, can you absolutely know it's true? Like without, beyond a shadow of a doubt, this is inherently true. Next, how do you react or what happens when you believe that thought? And then finally, who would you be without that thought? We have to pause because what happens is that when we are working from this place of anxiety and fear, that's like the survival part of our brain. And we have to bring that functioning from the survival part of our brain into the prefrontal cortex right here, which is where we are able to actually think critically and logically, right? We're not making decisions based on reactions and instinct. We're making it based on what we know, right? I always say that there's a difference between knowing in your mind and knowing in your heart, even though I know your heart's not a part of the brain, but that's how it feels. It feels like a split. You can know something logically, but you may not feel it. You can like say it to yourself till you're blue in the face, but it doesn't feel real. And that's why we have to engage in this self-analysis, because essentially what that survival part of your brain is going to do is you have to think of it like an air conditioning. And I believe Tony Robbins is the one who came up with this, but you think about your brain as being set at room temperature. So room temperature in Fahrenheit is like 74 degrees about. And if you start to fail too much, if you are falling below what you perceive as being acceptable or a negative change in your life, you start dipping and it's getting colder, you're going to kick on the heat and you're going to bring things back up to room temperature. But similarly, if you start to heat up too much and you start to have more success and you're going farther beyond what your comfort level is, you start going up there, you're also going to cool things down. You're going to kick on the AC and you're going to bring it right back down to room temperature. And that's where we end up doing things like self-sabotage. It is a normal part of, it's a normal reaction. It is a normal part of being human, because your brain is doing its job of keeping you safe by keeping you in the status quo. So the other way we can change the circuitry is not just by the self-reflection and the, reaffirming these new thoughts to ourselves, which they don't even need to be super positive, right? Like even something like, let's say you want to start a business and you have to like put yourself out there. You're like, I'm going to start posting about it on social media, and you feel really scared about it, right? You don't have to be like, hell yeah, I'm going to put it out there. Everything's going to work. I'm going to be rich in like 5 minutes. It doesn't need to be outlandish. It doesn't even need to be, it's going to be great. People are going to have a positive response to it, because it's just as likely you'll post, and more often than not, you post and it's crickets. So it can be something as simple as other people have done it. Other people do it. Not everybody sees every post on social media, so I don't have to feel weird about putting this out there because not everyone's even going to see it. Or it can even be something as simple as, it is safe for me to put myself out there. These kind of thoughts help your brain start creating new pathways. But the most powerful thing you can do is live through some disconfirming experiences. So a disconfirming experience is essentially an experience that you're having that disconfirms the negative belief that you have. So if I were to tell you right now, like whatever risks you're thinking about taking or whatever things that you're working on that you're like, or knowing you need to do that maybe you're dragging your feet on doing, we all do it. If there's fear there, a lot of times if you look back into your life, look back at your life and you say, okay, where else have I taken risks before and had them pay off? If you look back and just take inventory of that, you're showing your brain like, hey, I've lived through this before and I've been fine. So now I can do this again. I can take this action again and know that I'm going to be okay. I can move to this new city. I can do this thing. And the wild part about this is that even if you fail, your brain is still going to create a new neural pathway that reinforces that it's safe for you to be taking those risks and to be going after what you want. So the first example I like to use is when I started my business. Like when I had first started, I was first working in my business. The first few months were so rocky. This is not a surprise. It was like I was barely making any money. I couldn't seem to find my first client. I was really struggling. I was really, really struggling. I didn't have any like long-term clients. I would have a few sessions here and there, and I was undercharging. I was being too available. I like basically burning myself out because I was always on. So it wasn't going well. And I was working with a coach too, but I was like relying on her pep talks to help me just make that even inconsistent action. And that wasn't helping. That was not like, that's not sustainable. And after a while, I was like getting sick of it because at this point, it's like I'd cashed out a small 401k from a previous job. And I'm like, I can't keep going like this. I have to figure something out. And I was like, why am I feeling so much resistance? What is my fear? What's going on here? So I sat down and I just started writing out all the potential reasons why I was dragging my feet or why I was inconsistent. I just listed them all out. And I'm going through them, including like making some things up. I was truly like trying to get to the bottom of it. Let me find out what is going on. And really, when I listed these things out, what I saw that had been a repeating theme or pattern in all the reasons that I listed is that I was afraid of feeling like a failure. I was afraid of doing all of this work and it not working. That's what I was afraid of, because that I was making that mean that I was a failure and I couldn't hack it. And when I thought about it, I was like, that's it? I'm afraid of a feeling? I'm afraid of an emotion. Me, a Pisces, a double Pisces, sun and moon. I am afraid of an emotion. And so I had this moment where I said to myself, you know what? That's very silly, because I think on average emotions last, like if you were to sit with your feelings, emotions last about like 30 seconds. And so I told myself, let's try something different. Because if we're afraid of the work not paying off, and so therefore we are not working, let's try the opposite. I said for 30 days, the next 30 days, and this was like January, February or so, for the next 30 days, I am going to do everything in my power. I am just going to work with no expectation of results. I'm going to just do my work every single day. I'm going to post to social media. I'm going to follow up with people who have been interested, and I am not going to let my emotions get in the way. I'm just going to do it like a freaking robot. I'm just going to keep working at it and not even think about it. And then if at the end nothing has happened, I can do something differently. But I owe it to myself to spend 30 days working as hard as I could to see what would happen. And when I say as hard as I could, I mean within reason. I wasn't pushing myself beyond like an 8-hour workday. I'm just doing the work that I had been wanting to do and procrastinating. So I did. I set about, I spent 30 days. I posted to social media every single day. I talked about my stuff every single day. I just tackled that to-do list, all of these plans that I had. And what was wild is that, of course, I didn't actually fail. I wound up signing my first 3 clients into a group program. And it was the first month I was actually able to pay my bills from my business. So it was actually a huge moment. And that disconfirming experience of like, look, you can work for 30 days straight and be fine, and not just be fine, but actually get the result that you want. That started creating a new neural pathway. Now, I want to compare this to a time where I didn't have that successful result, because those are just as valuable. So, fast forward like 9 months later or so, I'm launching a program that I'm super excited about, but I had hired a business manager, I'd hired a copywriter, and I was launching a 6-month program, which I had never done before. And when I look back on it, first of all, like me and that copywriter still best friends, even though like I ended up firing her. I was literally just on the phone with her before this. So I realized that at the end, when I look back, I see what I did wrong, which was expanding too soon. I outsourced my voice, which is the thing that everybody loves about me. Obviously, I wrote a book. Like my writing is the thing that people love. So I outsourced the wrong thing, right? So I see the mistakes I made when I look back. But at the time, I'm just going based off what I've got in front of me. And so I launched this big program. I have somebody else writing my copy. I'm doing things like differently. And what ends up happening is that nobody signed up. Not a single person. I launched for a month. Not a single person signed up for this program. None. Okay. And this was after I'd had a lot of success. Like at that point, I had had like, I'd had like a launch. It was like a 14K cash launch. Like I'd experienced some really huge moments at this point in my business. And here I am, I launched something and nothing, not a single client. And of course, I ended up pivoting and I was able to like figure it out from there. I like picked up the pieces and, rebranded and did things that were more in line with what my zone of genius was, which we'll get into in a future episode. But what's incredible is that because naturally I survived that, I didn't die from having a failed launch. I survived it. I kept going. And because I was able to survive and keep going, that only strengthens the same neural pathway. Because what my brain takes away from it is I can try and fail, and I will still survive. So that is still a disconfirming experience. If you take a risk and you fail, your brain is still going to count that as a win because you survived it. You lived through it. So right now, in whatever phase of life you're in, you have a 100% survival rate. Congratulations. I'm very proud of you. You're still here. And that's a feat, honestly, in the world right now. So we're already here. So every time we have these experiences that don't turn out the way that we want, the fact that we just live through them alone is enough to continue strengthening these new neural pathways. And eventually, the more that we strengthen them through the self-reflection, through the meditation, through the action taking, the old ones become the pathway that's not as strong. They will fall away and the brain will start traveling this new pathway. That's what it's all about. So that is like the coolest thing to me. Like I could talk about that all day, but I also want to touch on epigenetics because I think that this is something that's super important to keep in mind. So epigenetics is essentially the study of genetics being passed down through people's families, like generations, right? The actual genetics that are going from a grandparent to a parent to a child, right? And what the studies are showing now is that the experiences that our ancestors have had can change our genetic makeup several generations ahead. So the most popular example that's used is that when people experience times of high anxiety, think of like the Holocaust or war or famine or things like that. What's happening is that mental switch that gets turned on toward anxiety and survival mode and things like that actually changes the genetic makeup of future generations. So a person who is pregnant with a child, like a person who is pregnant, and let's say that that child has a uterus and ovaries and, all of those things in there. The person carrying that child is not just carrying the child, but all of those child's eggs, all the future eggs. So all of us started as an egg, not just inside our parents' body, but inside our grandparents' body. And if that grandparent is experiencing really extreme stress and anxiety and flooding the system with cortisol, then the formation of those genes as that child is developing and those eggs are developing, it's going to affect the genetic code. It turns on certain things, which is why we can have predispositions in families to anxiety disorders, to depression, to things like that, because that has been the experience of our ancestors to this point. That, I think, is also probably one of the reasons why cycles of abuse are able to continue unless you go and really purposefully unlearn all of that, right? Like that's where it all comes from. And again, that's your genetic makeup. It creates predispositions. It may create certain disorders. That doesn't mean you need to stay stuck. I am somebody who believes in medicine. I've been on antidepressants. I have ADHD, so I've been on Adderall. I have those things and they do help me. Like those are things that I need in order to function based on my own genetic makeup. But it's no different than anything else. It's no different than having a predisposition toward diabetes or celiac disease or autoimmune disorders. It's the same kind of thing. It's made up in our genetics. And as promised, I said I would touch on a witchy topic at the end. I was going to touch on witch wounds, which if you've never heard that term before, a witch wound is essentially like a wound that your soul carries from having been alive during the 200 plus year period of the witch trials, which were prevalent all over. I mean, not just Europe and the Americas, it's all over the world. It was very popular. It still happens in a lot of places. People are still subject to violence and threats because of like being perceived as a witch. But this is not as science-based, okay? Like I'm going to put that out there as a disclaimer. This is not as science-based, but I think it kind of goes along with the conversation on epigenetics, so I wanted to touch on it. So with witch wounds, it's more of something that's like within our soul. So our souls, if you believe in reincarnation, as I do, we live multiple lifetimes, and we live lifetimes with the specific goal of learning things or growing in a certain way or having certain experiences. And the whole point being that we need to work on ourselves to a point where we can, really become compassionate, whole, holistic people who value humanity and can really elevate the world. That's what I think. I mean, this is definitely like a personal belief, but the idea is that if you have lived through a time in the past in which you were somehow persecuted for being a witch or being associated with witches, or just being in that time, maybe not being one of the victims, but being part of that society that was judging those people or being close to those people, that carries wounds down. Now, naturally, we can talk about how epigenetics, especially because that was directed predominantly toward people who identified as women, people who were on the outskirts. It was also a war against the poor. It was a war against anybody who was different. That was clearly something that can be passed down through epigenetics because that was a time of incredible stress, right? And it was continuing for such a long time that we're talking about multiple generations of that. But speaking of it from this spiritual place, I have identified like a few specific wounds that I see that are really common with people who feel that they may have lived during that time. And there's obviously no way to confirm that. This is not a science. This part is not scientific. It's just something that I find is that resonates with people who are very spiritual and who are really into all of the woo-woo things these days. And I think that's because part of us, like that, our souls who may have lived through that time period are committed to learning things differently and being able to live in a time where they can associate spiritually however they want without fear of persecution. Of course, in privileged zones, not everybody is able to enjoy that privilege. So, the wounds that I have found that are the most common is the first one is if you had to live a life of fear and hiding. So, essentially, if you were living in fear of being falsely accused, you had to constantly shrink away, right? Like you could not take on any attention was bad attention. So if you were to stand out in any way, your hair was too red, you were too outspoken, whatever, things like that, that was a reason to shrink. And so what you may do now in this lifetime is that you may dim your shine because getting noticed can have grave consequences. That's like what's been imprinted on you. And of course, like we can always point back to like childhood experiences in this lifetime that could explain it as well. I'm not here to say that like those are not valid. I am a science bitch. I'm all for it. I also think multiple things can be true. So whichever one resonates with you, that's all that matters. Another popular wound, the second of four that I've identified, was being killed for that individuality. So if you were that outspoken person, if you did say no to a powerful male's advances, like if you did stand out in some way and you were killed for it, that's only going to make you now more afraid of success. That's really how it is because you are afraid to actually stay in that light and to stay in a place where you are consistently being seen, consistently succeeding, consistently getting where you want to go because you're afraid that you're going to get harmed for it because you were in a past lifetime. And again, there are usually childhood based reasons that we can point to. I'm of the opinion that our souls like kind of choose to have like if you're an older soul, you're generally going to choose to have a really rocky childhood because you need these lessons activated early on so you can heal them later. So again, I think both can be true. And then honestly, like the last biggest one is economic oppression for me, because like I said, the witch trials, that was a war against the poor, because this was also the time in which modern medicine was becoming more popularized. And so a lot of times the people who were persecuted were midwives, herbalists, things like that. And who were those people? Generally, they were women, people who identified as women, or people on the outskirts of society. And by criminalizing them, it was, and one of the two of the only ways for like women in those times to make money, it was to do that to support the rise of modern medicine. It was like to promote doctors. Of course, poor people could not access doctors. That was for the rich. But by persecuting those people, it was promoting modern medicine and the doctors who were coming out of that field. And basically, how I see that now with people is that you're often unable to either imagine even having enough money to feel safe. Like that feels like something completely foreign. And you may even have a tendency to push away financial success. That can look like overspending money, or the second money hits your bank account, it's gone, right? It can be whether that's on bills or $600 bikinis, it doesn't matter. Like wherever, however, if you spend money as soon as it hits your account, that tells me you're probably not safe. And it could be for one of these reasons. And then, finally, the last one is going to be the people who were never persecuted, but maybe who had to participate in this societal construct, right, of some way, either ratting out their family and friends or seeing their family and friends taken away. And where I see those people struggling now is that there's almost a resistance to even interacting with anything that's spiritual or intuitive, like they're kind of cut off from that side of themselves. And it's because it's like, that's dangerous. It's too dangerous for me to touch, because that is what got me, and that's what got my whole family, or that's what got my community way back when. And again, I want to reiterate, I know this was a video about science, and witch wounds are not scientific at all, unless you want to think about it in terms of epigenetics. But rarely can we trace our ancestry back to those times. So I highlight these just because they're another way of thinking about it. If you are a spiritual person, if this does align with your beliefs, like, more things can be true. And as you know, I'm a big proponent of it's not crazy if it works. So whether the science is more compelling to you, whether something like witch wounds are more compelling to you, it doesn't matter. All of these things, that contributes to the disconfirming experiences. That's what allows us to believe new things and to move on from these things. That's what it does. So that is our weekly Witchcast for August 23rd. I hope everybody learned something today. If you want to get your questions answered, definitely join the Witch's Way to Wealth Community Coven, because that is where I engage with members, and they get a special preview. They get to come to these calls live way before they're posted to YouTube or my podcast. So if you're tuning in live right now, this is your chance. I want to hear your questions. If you have any, I'll stick around for a second and answer them as best I can. I know we have 5 people, and I know there can be a lag between StreamYard and YouTube. So go ahead. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Not forever hold your peace. Just take the questions to the group, because then I can answer them there. Some people are shy. They don't want to ask questions live, and that's okay. Anyone, anyone, anyone? Trying to be patient in case people are typing. Of course, I don't know if they are. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and assume that everybody's good. Everybody's got their questions answered, or alternatively, that I've hit you with a lot of information, which I know I have, and everybody's mulling it over and getting their questions ready. So if you have questions, come on by the Witch's Way to Wealth Community Coven, ask them there. I will answer them for you, and we'll get into it. That's a place for us to have these discussions. So go ahead. If you're not in the group already, there's a link here in the description of the video. Click there, join the group. You'll get it, like, it's a quick form to fill out, and then you'll get admitted pretty quickly, and we can dive into more of these topics. I will see you next week for the next weekly Witchcast. And I'm excited. If you've got any topics you want me to cover, come on over to the group and tell me what you'd like to hear. If you've got any questions, I'm an open book, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much for tuning in this whole time. I know it was a long one, but I will see you guys next week. Have a good one. Bye.